Hi guys, so today I'm going to be breaking down this product render that I made in Blender, and I'm going to be taking you through my creative process and explaining my major decisions in making this. So let's get into it. So here we are in Blender, and we're going to delete everything as per usual, and then we're going to add in two images as planes, which we're going to use. That will be the top and the side labels. They come in as rectangles, so to speak, and I'm just going to cut out the part that I need out of that. So you could imagine this as you printed this on a piece of paper, and now you have to cut it out with a pair of scissors. So right now I'm just moving the edges and the vertices around so I can capture more area, and I'm going to use a knife tool to cut out that interesting arch at the top and delete the extra faces. Next up, I'm going to take the top face and apply a subdivision surface modifier and loop tools to circles, and then project this on the texture. I just really want to get that texture onto the circular shape that I'm making. The next thing I'm doing here is I'm just kind of filling the gaps in this huge plane. So in 3D, it's kind of good practice to have a nice distribution of faces and vertices, and that's just what I'm trying to do here. And besides, I'm going to deform this later because I'm going to bend it around the bottle. So it's just really nice to kind of go through and fill in those gaps. So the next thing I'm doing here is actually just bending this with a simple deform modifier. Even before bringing the bottle in, I just want to curve it around and see how it looks. So yeah, it looks good. So let's just move on. So we're going to add in a cylinder, and that's going to be the base shape for the bottle slash jar that we're going to be making. And then we're going to add a subdivision surface and bevel modifier to just kind of make things smooth and also crisp. And then I'm just going to go in and start inserting, extruding, and the end goal here is pretty simple. Just get the bottle shape. It's fairly easy to make a bottle in Blender. Well, a bottle slash jar. It's fairly easy to make that happen since it's mostly just a cylinder. It's also very easy to make the cap, which is what I'm doing right now. It's just grabbing a circle and extruding and just kind of resizing until everything looks good. So after getting the bottle shape that we like, the next step is to start texturing it. The first thing I'm going to do is go into my rendered view so I can see things more clearly and just make this body glass. And you want to make sure there's a solidify modifier on that so it actually has a thickness to it. Then I'm going to make the top a black metal and just make sure the paper is sticking to the top of it. Next up, I'm going to extract the honey from the bottle itself by just going to edit mode and selecting these faces. I'm just going to remove the modifiers, fill that face, and that's literally just going to be the honey. So to texture the honey, I went with a transmissive material, just make it transparent, and made that brown, of course. But if you just do that, it just looks like glass, which means you have to do some more work on it. And what you need to do is you need to look into some volume absorption and also reduce the roughness so that the highlights are not like crazy. So that's literally what I just did. I dropped in some volume absorption and made it look more dark and rich, and then I kind of dropped the sharpness of the highlights by increasing the roughness, and that's pretty much how you make honey. Really quickly, I'm just going to put this in a scene. It's looking good already, but I just want to add some surface imperfections and some texture to the paper just to make it look that much more realistic, especially when you render it at high resolutions. So I'm using the next texture, and I'm just kind of messing around with this, making it super small to kind of give that bumpy feeling that you get on paper. But you have to be careful when you're doing stuff like this because paper and leather kind of are similar, and sometimes you can actually get leather or something that looks like leather when you're trying to make something that looks like paper. So you kind of have to play around with the noise and make sure that you are closer to paper than you are to leather. Or you can just solve that problem entirely by getting image textures. So next up, I've decided to be a bit more generous and add more product to the package. So I'm just increasing the size of the honey, and I think that makes it look more attractive. So next up, I'm going to work on this label that I've wrapped around the bottle. And what I want to do is just make some minor adjustments to the mesh, and then so there's this thing that happens when you kind of use paper and you print stuff on it. Around the edges, there's this like fading, and I'm just going to replicate that by using a pointing S map and I think it looks makes the everything look more realistic, just that faded edge. So next up, we're gonna work on the top cap, and for that, we're gonna use noise textures to make surface imperfections from scratch. Uh, of course, you can always use image textures for this. I just like to use procedural textures because they make the file super small. So yeah, you can really get away with a lot if you use procedural textures. It does kind of task your CPU a bit more, but at the same time, you also kind of get away with smaller file sizes. And of course, the texture literally creates itself. That in itself is dope. So what I'm doing here is I'm combining a Voronoi texture and a normal noise texture to kind of simulate dust accumulating on the surface. You want a little bit of that, not too much, not too little, and that kind of gives you all the realism that you need, pretty much. Especially for a product render, because you want it to be clean, but not too clean, right? So you don't want fingerprints all over your products, but at the same time, you don't want it to be like super reflective. So yeah, I think this is a nice compromise for that. So for the glass imperfections, just take a noise texture, crank up the details, and plug it into the roughness, and you're pretty much good. So the next thing I worked on is this paper seal that you are seeing right now, and for that it's just a couple of extrusions and moving the UVs around, and you kind of get what you need by just doing that. It's pretty simple shape, so I was done with it before long, and I just had to do some adjustments at the top, and that was it. So now the set design begins. I'm first going to start by making the table, and that's just a long rectangle that I'm going to extrude to make it very long and wide cuboid, so to speak. Basically, I'm just going to UV unwrap this now, immediately after adding the bevel and subsoft modifier. I'm not going to apply the modifiers, I'm just going to UV unwrap it immediately, and then I'm going to apply texture immediately. So what's going to happen is the texture is going to be applied to a base mesh, and then that mesh is going to get beveled and subdivided. So the seams that would usually appear in between the islands is just going to get smoothed out, and it's going to look kind of natural, like you would expect wood to be, kind of the grains smoothing over from one edge to another. That's usually what happens when you subdivide after unwrapping a low poly mesh. And of course, as you can probably see, you can adjust the hue and saturation of textures. So now I'm working on the tray. uh, Most of the objects in this scene are pretty basic. There's like a wooden table, there's a wooden cupboard, there's a wooden tray. It's mostly just wood, but more importantly, it's just basic shapes, right? Now, the reason why I'm making these is partly, of course, because they are basic shape. Because if they were more complex shapes, like if they were more complex than the product itself, I would probably just get them online. And there's something to be said about making your models versus getting them online, and it all comes down to time and, I guess, interest. If you're really interested in modeling, I guess you could take some time out to make everything in the scene. But of course, you have to be careful about getting attached to models, because not everything you make will make sense in the final render. And if you spend like 5 hours on that one thing, you probably want it to show up in the render, which is not healthy. So whenever you're making a scene, you should always think about how much investment is worth it, right? So if you're going to be spending 5 hours making one thing that's going to appear on, in the corner somewhere, that's probably going to be defocused, should probably get that from the internet, right? So if it's not something that's going to be very important to your scene, it doesn't make sense to spend so much time making it, unless you are trying to learn how to make that thing specifically. So yeah, that's pretty much what I would say about that. Anyways, for the tray, there's not much work left. I'm just going to fill up that empty space, and I'm just going to deviate from the reference that I have on the side just a little bit by having mine be composed of these wooden planks. So next up, I'm making the honey dipper, and I'm starting with a cylinder and dropping loop cuts and inserting and extruding along normals. So you can notice how much I'm trying to match it to the reference here. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use proportional editing to kind of make that bulge at the top and make some size adjustments. And then I'm going to add in a subdivision surface modifier alongside a bevel just to smoothen it out. Then after that, I'm going to unwrap it, but not applying the modifiers, because I think unwrapping a low poly mesh and then subdividing it after kind of gives you a more smooth transition along edges between seams basically. Next up, we have the string, which I mostly made with geometry nodes. Now, this is more of a complex project on its own. Maybe in the future, I'm going to make a separate video about how I made this, and I might even make it like a detailed tutorial where I kind of go through it step by step, because making something like this is fairly complicated because it involves a bit of math and kind of thinking outside the normal realm of 3D modeling basically. So this is more of a procedural approach. So, and unfortunately, even though I spent so much time on this string, it ended up being blurred because of the shallow depth of field that I used for the shot. I didn't know that was gonna happen beforehand, otherwise I wouldn't have made it so detailed. So yeah, there we go. Anyways, before I bore you so much with this, let's just assume I'm gonna make something else explaining this in detail, and let's just move on to the next thing. So seems like it's taking forever, but we're finally here. We're out here building the final scene, and I'm just trying to block this out and trying to get something that looks nice. So at this point, it's more of an artistic approach. So I already have all the assets that I need. I have the products, and it's just about setting the lights, setting the assets, and making everything look great. So I had a sketch earlier, and I'm just basically trying to match this to the sketch. It's like I'm gonna have the product in front, off to the side a bit, and then behind that I'm gonna have the tray. And I'm literally just playing around here and kind of seeing what looks nice in the camera. Next up, I'm bringing in the honey dipper and just positioning that in the scene, and trying to see how I can incorporate that with the rest of the items. I have a kind of room setup. It's just a basic cube, and I want to put some texture on that. I'll make that wood, and of course adjust the UV so it actually looks like wood, not just some stretched weird thing. Next up, the string. We get to wrap that around the honey dipper. I'm doing this manually. I'm sure there's probably a much better way to wrap a string around some cylindrical object, but I didn't have the patience or the persistence to figure that out. So the next thing I'm going to do now is try and detail out the room a little bit more. Try and give that window a little bit more detailing basically. Basically try and make it more like an actual room. Now it doesn't have to be excessively detailed. It just has to have roughly the right shape and texture, just so the light bounces can be a little bit more realistic. And then after that, we start to make the honey that's going to drip off the honey dipper. So in hindsight, I should have made this by just duplicating the mesh directly from the honey dipper and just working on that. But for some reason, I decided to grab a whole other mesh and start sculpting it to try and fit the shape of the honey dipper. So if you want to try something like this, you should probably just duplicate the existing mesh and then work on that. There's no point to doing this, so probably don't do this. Moving on. After I was done, I just applied the honey material that we made earlier to this. So now we have honey dripping. Next up, we have the cupboard that I put at the back, and that's just a bunch of planks that I've arranged together. And this is very low level of detail because it's going to be far back and it's going to be blurred. So I'm just resizing this and making sure it fits in that corner and it doesn't interfere with the elements I have in the foreground. Next up, I'm just going to make a lot of simple pots that I'm going to put in the cupboard. They're very simple. They don't have to be too detailed, especially because they will be way back, and because they are not super detailed, they won't really contribute much to the render times, so you can render really fast. The scene looks realistic and you still render fast because the items that are further from the camera have less detail. Next up, I'm going to move the room around until I can get just a part of the window in the frame. And then I'm going to make a stool and I'm going to place it from the cupboard just to fill up that empty space in front. And then I'm going to add fog to this scene, just a volumetrics. That's just going to make the scene have a lot of depth in it. Then I'm going to duplicate one of these products and move them backwards. Basically, you just have like two products in slightly different presentations, and have one blurred, have one in view. I feel like that makes it more interesting. So now we have fog, and the last thing I want to add to this is some dust particles, right? So I'm just making a single dust particle and scattering it around the scene. So if I go to rendered view, you can actually see the giant dust particles, which I'm going to just scale down significantly. And yeah, that pretty much wraps it up. Hi, so if you made it this far, thank you for watching and sticking till the end. I will be making more content like this in the future and hopefully more step-by-step tutorials. But at any rate, just I guess watch out. And yeah, that'll be all from me. If there's any questions and you want to ask them, I guess you could just put them in the comment section and I'll just attend to them. Also, if there was anything in the video that you wanted me to expand more upon, like the rope tutorial for example, you could just also comment that and I'll make a step-by-step tutorial on that. So yeah, and until next time, bye bye.